Flight attendant denies twin boys first class. Unaware their father owns the airline. Hello everyone. Have you ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated simply because of your appearance, background, or because someone made false assumptions about who you are? In this story, you will meet two bright young boys whose fates were nearly derailed by someone who believed they did not belong where they rightfully should be. Before we dive into their journey, let us know where you're watching from, because every voice matters and every story deserves to be heard. Nathaniel Reed was a man who had grown accustomed to moving through life with a calm, unwavering confidence. He wore impeccably tailored suits, exuding the composure of a seasoned businessman. His eyes, sharp yet warm, reflected the wisdom of a man who had faced challenges head-on and never wavered in his determination. Once, Nathaniel had been just an ordinary man with extraordinary dreams, eager to change the course of his destiny. Decades of relentless perseverance had transformed him into more than just a success story. He became a titan of the aviation industry, quietly overseeing an empire in the skies that he had built from the ground up. Unlike many industry moguls who basked in their status and power, Nathaniel chose to keep a low profile. When he traveled with his twin sons, Lucas and Liam, he preferred to do so as an ordinary passenger, without fanfare, without privilege, and without special treatment. Lucas and Liam were virtually identical to the casual observer, yet in every meaningful way they were completely distinct. At 15 years old, they were at that transformative stage of life when the world still seemed like a place brimming with endless possibilities. They were intelligent, curious, and overflowing with youthful energy. Lucas, the older twin by 5 minutes, had a passionate love for history and politics. He devoured books on ancient civilizations, revolutions, and the visionaries who had reshaped societies. Liam, on the other hand, was an artist at heart, a dreamer drawn to painting, music, and every form of creativity that allowed him to express the depth of his emotions. This trip wasn't just a vacation. It was part of an educational journey that Nathaniel had carefully planned. He wanted his sons to see the world beyond textbooks, to experience history where it happened, and to understand that travel has the power to break boundaries and expand minds. 4 months, the boys had been eagerly awaiting this adventure. London, the city of grand museums, towering landmarks, and the constant interplay of old traditions and new ideas, awaited them. But before they could immerse themselves in its wonders, an unexpected confrontation was about to unfold, right in the air. Next, the story will continue with the unfolding incident. At its heart, this trip was meant to be more than just a vacation. It was an immersive educational experience. Nathaniel wanted his sons to witness history firsthand, to explore museums, admire grand architectural marvels, and stand in places where new ideas had once clashed with old traditions. He firmly believed that travel had the power to open young minds, to encourage them to step beyond their comfort zones, and to engage with perspectives that challenged their own. The mere thought of being in another country filled Lucas and Liam with boundless excitement. Their mother, Clara, wholeheartedly supported the plan. Though Clara had commitments back home, she encouraged her sons to embrace this adventure with their father. She trusted Nathaniel's judgment and loved seeing her boys discover the world through their own eyes. On the morning of their departure, Nathaniel arrived at the airport with Lucas and Liam in tow. He had booked 3 first-class tickets, but in true Nathaniel fashion he did so quietly without making any spectacle of his wealth or influence. Sometimes airline staff recognized him, sometimes they didn't, but he never went out of his way to correct them. He preferred anonymity, relishing the opportunity to observe people as they truly were, unaffected by the knowledge of his status or power. At times, this meant he moved through the airport just like any other passenger, waiting in lines, sitting in standard lounges, and quietly observing every aspect of the airline's service. But on this particular day, fate had placed them in the path of Deborah Simmons. Deborah was a seasoned flight attendant, someone who had spent nearly 2 decades in the aviation industry. She took immense pride in her professionalism and saw herself as a pillar of discipline in the skies. However, she also possessed an unspoken habit, a tendency to judge passengers by their appearance. She was meticulous in her duties, some might even say unyieldingly rigid, especially when it came to who she believed deserved to sit in first class. She took her job very seriously, almost as though she had been personally tasked with preserving the exclusivity of luxury travel. And so, the moment her eyes landed on Nathaniel and his 2 sons, her subconscious biases immediately surfaced. Lucas and Liam, dressed in casual sweatshirts and sneakers, carrying backpacks covered in bold, youthful designs, did not fit her expectation of first-class travelers. A flicker of disapproval flashed across her face, a reaction so subtle that most might have missed it. But Nathaniel? He saw it clearly. He had encountered this type of scrutiny before, and he knew exactly where this was heading. What Deborah Simmons did not know, however, was that she was about to make a mistake that would change her career forever. Lucas and Liam's backpacks were adorned with colorful designs, showcasing their youthful personalities. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's attire was understated, an expensive but unbranded jacket, a pair of comfortable trousers and well-worn sneakers that had accompanied him on countless flights. To an unbiased eye, they simply looked like a father and his two sons embarking on an adventure. But to Deborah Simmons, their appearance didn't quite fit the image of first-class travelers. She was accustomed to seeing sleek business suits, designer luggage, and an air of formality, or so she believed first class should be. As Nathaniel and the twins approached the boarding gate, Deborah stood at her post, greeting passengers with a polite but distant smile, the kind that barely touched her eyes. When Nathaniel handed her their boarding passes, she took them without a word, her brow immediately furrowing as she scanned them. Then she glanced up at the family, her gaze flickering with something unspoken, a silent question, a lingering doubt. She studied the twins, who were practically buzzing with excitement, then glanced over Nathaniel's shoulder as if expecting someone more glamorous, more important, someone who actually belonged in first class. "Step forward, sir," she said at last. Then, with a forced politeness masking her skepticism, she added, "These are first-class tickets. Are you sure you're in the right line?" Nathaniel met her gaze, his expression calm but knowing. He had seen this play out before. It was never pleasant, but by now, he had learned to navigate these moments with quiet composure. "Yes, this is the correct line. Thank you," he replied smoothly. Deborah hesitated, as though still searching for a reason to challenge him further. But after a brief pause, she relented. "All right, sir. Proceed. Welcome aboard." Nathaniel and his sons moved past her, relieved to finally step onto the aircraft. The tension lingered, but Nathaniel brushed it off. He was far more interested in the pure joy on his sons' faces as they took in the luxurious first-class cabin. The spacious seats, the reclining chairs, the touchscreen monitors, the soft blankets and pillows. Lucas and Liam examined everything with wide-eyed wonder, comparing notes on which movies they would watch first. Nathaniel leaned back in his seat, smiling to himself. He loved seeing his boys like this, unfiltered, thrilled, filled with the excitement of discovery. But Deborah was not done. As passengers continued boarding, she kept glancing in their direction, her brow creasing deeper each time she caught sight of them. It was as if their very presence unsettled her, as though she believed they posed some kind of silent threat to the exclusivity of first class. Each time Lucas or Liam rummaged through their backpacks, pulled out a snack, or whispered excitedly about their upcoming trip, Deborah's gaze darkened just a little more. To her, they didn't belong here. But what she didn't know was that this flight was about to change her career forever. Over the years, Deborah Simmons had grown accustomed to polished business professionals, older couples exuding quiet elegance, and celebrities who shielded themselves behind sunglasses and an air of exclusivity. To her, these were the people who belonged in first class. But Lucas and Liam? Their free-spirited excitement unsettled her. The way they laughed easily, chatted animatedly, and eagerly explored their surroundings, it was as if they hadn't quite grasped the unspoken rules of how first-class passengers were expected to behave. Once the last of the first-class passengers had boarded, Deborah hesitated for a moment, then made her way toward Nathaniel and the twins. "Sir," she said, her tone courteous yet laced with a thinly veiled tension. Nathaniel looked up, meeting her gaze with a composed expression. "May I see your tickets again, please?" Lucas and Liam exchanged a confused glance, but Nathaniel remained calm. "Certainly," he said, retrieving the same boarding passes and handing them over. Deborah studied them closely, flipping the papers over as if searching for signs of tampering, her expression unreadable. After a pause she spoke. "Just verifying," she said, her voice clipped. "We have to make sure everything is in order." Finally, she returned the tickets with a tight-lipped smile, as though she hadn't quite found what she was looking for, but wasn't ready to let go of her suspicions either. "It appears fine." Nathaniel accepted the tickets, offering a calm nod. "Thank you." He turned back toward his seat, but he hadn't missed the shift in his son's demeanor. Lucas' brows furrowed slightly, a flicker of annoyance flashing in his eyes. Liam cast a worried glance at his father, his fingers tightening around his sketchbook. "Dad, is everything okay?" Lucas asked, lowering his voice. Nathaniel offered a reassuring smile, leaning in slightly so only his sons could hear. "Everything's fine," he whispered. "She's just doing her job. Don't let it ruin the flight. Let's focus on enjoying the trip." Deborah lingered a moment longer before retreating to her post at the front of the cabin, her watchful gaze never quite leaving them. Then with a low rumble the engines came to life. A moment later the captain's voice filled the cabin with a smooth, practiced announcement, welcoming the passengers aboard and detailing their flight path. As the plane soared into the sky, cutting through the endless stretch of blue, Nathaniel leaned back in his seat, his eyes briefly closing. The flight would last several hours with dinner service, the possibility of some sleep, and an early morning arrival in London. Lucas put on his headphones, but every so often, his gaze drifted toward Deborah. Something about the way she looked at them didn't sit right. Liam, meanwhile, busied himself flipping through the in-flight entertainment options, occasionally glancing at the sketchbook in his lap. The tip of his pencil moved in quiet strokes, attempting to capture the way the clouds swirled outside the window, the soft hush of the cabin, the muted glow of overhead lights. Nathaniel pretended to rest, but even with his eyes closed, he could still feel the weight of Deborah's gaze lingering over them. And he knew this wasn't over yet. Yet even as Nathaniel rested his head against the seat, he could still feel Deborah's lingering gaze. He had spent years in high-stakes boardrooms, contract negotiations, and corporate dealings. He knew suspicion when he saw it. He had encountered subtle bias countless times before, and over time, he had mastered the art of navigating it with quiet grace. It was precisely because of these experiences that he never revealed his true position within the airline. He wanted an unfiltered perspective, an honest look at how his staff treated passengers who didn't fit into their preconceived notions of who belonged in first class. And today, Deborah was giving him a painfully clear demonstration of exactly that. Once the plane leveled off, the flight attendants began making their rounds, serving refreshments. Deborah moved through first class, offering drinks and small plates of gourmet appetizers. When she reached Nathaniel's row, she forced a smile, stiff, professional, but far from genuine. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Nathaniel nodded politely. "Just water, please." Lucas and Liam each requested a soda, their voices polite but reserved. Deborah nodded briskly, disappearing down the aisle. A few moments later she returned, setting their drinks down on a tray with precise, deliberate movements. "Thank you so much," Lucas said brightly, his natural politeness shining through. Liam, a little more reserved, offered a small nod of gratitude. Deborah barely acknowledged them. She simply turned on her heel and moved on, her shoulders stiff with some unspoken tension. Nathaniel didn't miss it, and neither did his sons. Time passed slowly in the sky. The quiet hum of conversation filled the cabin, blending with the occasional clink of glasses and the soft murmur of in-flight entertainment. A businessman spoke into his phone in hushed tones, discussing delayed contracts. A mother in another row read a bedtime story about knights and dragons to her young son. Lucas and Liam sipped their sodas, leaning toward each other in quiet conversation. They whispered about which museum they wanted to visit first, what kind of art supplies Liam might find in London, and how Lucas couldn't wait to stand in the very places he had read about in his history books. They tried to keep their voices low, but every so often, their excitement bubbled over into small bursts of laughter. And each time Deborah noticed. More than once she cast a sharp glance in their direction, her disapproval hidden beneath a thin veil of professionalism. She made a point of checking their seatbelts unnecessarily, subtly reminding them to lower their voices, cautioning that first class was a quiet space meant for passengers who needed to rest. Nathaniel could sense the tension building, his sons beginning to feel the weight of the scrutiny. He exhaled slowly, reminding himself to keep his composure. This was far from over. Nathaniel didn't want to dampen his sons' excitement entirely, so he chose to redirect their focus elsewhere. As the dinner service began, a different flight attendant named Emily Carter arrived at their row, her warm smile immediately easing the tension that had been building throughout the flight. She treated the family with kindness, addressing each of them politely, and even engaging in friendly conversation with Lucas and Liam. "So, is this your first time in London?" she asked, her tone light and welcoming. Lucas grinned. "Yes. I've been reading all about the historical sites. We're going to visit the Tower of London first." Liam, more reserved but equally excited, nodded. and I can't wait to sketch some of the architecture. Emily chuckled. Well, you two are going to have an amazing time. London is full of history and inspiration. I think you'll love it. Her warmth stood in stark contrast to Deborah's cold demeanor, and Nathaniel found himself grateful that at least one member of the crew understood how passengers should be treated. As the dinner plates were cleared away and the cabin lights dimmed, the atmosphere settled into a quiet lull. But then, Deborah reappeared. She leaned down toward Nathaniel, her voice hushed but pointed. Sir, I need to verify something. Nathaniel exhaled slowly before looking up at her. You purchased these tickets yourself, correct? His calm expression didn't waver, but beneath it, his patience was beginning to wear thin. Yes, I did. Deborah's gaze flickered toward Lucas and Liam, then back to Nathaniel. Were they possibly upgraded? Or did you redeem miles? She pressed. We have certain policies regarding unaccompanied minors or those traveling on special tickets. I just want to be absolutely sure everything is correct for these two. Nathaniel set his jaw, his tone measured but firm. My sons are not unaccompanied. I'm sitting right here. He held her gaze. These are fully paid first-class tickets, purchased through official channels. Everything is exactly as it should be. Deborah nodded, but something about her expression remained unconvinced. I understand. Please bear with me, I'm just following protocol. Lucas and Liam exchanged a glance. Lucas bit his lip, while Liam tried to distract himself by shading the edges of his latest sketch, his pencil moving in quiet, methodical strokes. Nathaniel could feel his son's discomfort rising and he hated it. He refused to cause a scene, but he also refused to let them feel unwelcome in a place they had every right to be. So he made a silent decision. In a few hours they would land. And when they did, he would make sure this incident didn't go unnoticed. For the next stretch of the flight, the cabin fell into an uneasy quiet. Some passengers dozed off, lulled by the soft hum of the engines. Others watched movies or scrolled through their devices. Nathaniel leaned his head back and closed his eyes for a moment, attempting to clear his mind. But just as he was about to drift into a light sleep, a voice broke the silence. And when he opened his eyes, Deborah was standing there again. Just as Nathaniel was beginning to drift into a light sleep, a voice broke through the quiet cabin. Excuse me, sir, we need to speak. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dimmed cabin lights. Standing over him was Deborah Simmons. And she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a tall man in uniform, likely a lead flight attendant, his expression marked with unease. Nathaniel sat up, his face calm but unreadable, meeting Deborah's gaze without flinching. What can I do for you? He asked smoothly. Deborah cleared her throat, shifting on her feet. I'm afraid I need to check your identification as well as the identification of your sons, she said, keeping her tone neutral. This is a standard requirement for minors traveling internationally. We need to ensure that everything is in order. Across the row, Lucas stiffened. Liam's eyes widened, his grip tightening around his sketchbook. Nathaniel remained still for a moment. Then, with controlled precision, he reached into his carry-on, retrieved their passports and handed them over. Deborah took them, flipping through each page slowly, her fingers tracing every stamp, every letter, as though she expected to find something, anything, to justify her suspicions. The lead attendant standing beside her shifted awkwardly. Is everything fine, Deborah? He asked, his voice hesitant, uncertain. He flicked a brief, apologetic glance toward Nathaniel, as if he already suspected the answer. After a long moment, Deborah finally exhaled. Yes, she said begrudgingly, snapping the passports shut. Everything seems fine. She returned the documents and Nathaniel slid them back into his bag without a word. But just when he thought the ordeal was over, Deborah pressed on. We had an incident a few months ago, she continued, her voice suddenly taking on a defensive edge. A situation where passengers who weren't supposed to be in first class caused a disturbance. I'm just being cautious, especially when minors are traveling. I hope you understand. Nathaniel breathed deeply, feeling the tension tighten in his neck and shoulders. But still, he did not break his composure. His voice remained low, firm, and controlled, ensuring that no other passengers were disturbed. I understand the need for caution, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. But we have already been checked, repeatedly. Is there any other proof you require? Or can we finally have a peaceful flight? For the first time, Deborah faltered. It was clear she hadn't expected him to push back so directly. She took a half step backward, clearing her throat before mumbling a weak apology. "I'm sorry if you felt inconvenienced, sir. I was just following procedure." Nathaniel gave a slow, deliberate nod, his silence speaking louder than any words. And as Deborah stepped away, it became painfully obvious. Her approach had not been welcome. "Not here. Not now." The lead attendant gently touched her shoulder, a quiet indication that it was time to leave the matter alone. And with that, Nathaniel leaned back in his seat once more. But this time he wasn't closing his eyes to rest. He was simply watching. Because he knew, this flight wasn't over yet. The lead flight attendant gently placed a hand on Deborah's shoulder, a silent indication that it was time to move on. With a forced, tight-lipped smile, Deborah stepped away, though the tension she left behind lingered in the air like an unwelcome shadow. Nathaniel let out a slow breath, exhaling the frustration he had carefully kept in check. Across from him, Lucas and Liam did the same, their shoulders sagging slightly in relief. The lead attendant, clearly sensing the uncomfortable exchange, cast Nathaniel a sympathetic look before turning and following Deborah down the aisle. The moment she was out of earshot, Lucas turned to his father, his face etched with confusion and frustration. "Dad, why does she keep bothering us?" he asked, his voice tinged with something unspoken. Beside him, Liam shifted uncomfortably, his voice softer. "Did we do something wrong?" Nathaniel shook his head, his tone steady, measured. "No, you didn't." He paused for a moment, ensuring the weight of his words would sink in. "Sometimes people make assumptions, about how you look, about how they think you should act. But those assumptions? They have nothing to do with your worth." Lucas frowned, his fingers tapping absently on the armrest. "Does this happen to you a lot?" Nathaniel's gaze flickered, just for a second. He had spent a lifetime dealing with situations like this, learning how to navigate them without losing his composure. He had been dismissed, underestimated, second-guessed, all before people realized who he was. And he had handled it every time. But seeing his sons go through it? That was different. That ignited something inside him. Instead of answering directly, Nathaniel simply nodded. "I've experienced many different kinds of reactions in my life," he admitted, his voice even. "This is just one of them." Lucas and Liam exchanged a glance. They understood. Even if they didn't like it. The rest of the flight passed with uneasy moments, punctuated by the feeling of being watched. Deborah never ventured too far, hovering in the background, her watchful eyes assessing them with every passing minute. Lucas tried to lose himself in his music, but he couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. Liam, usually lost in his sketches, found his pencil strokes hesitant, distracted. Nathaniel alternated between reading a business magazine and feigning rest, the quiet frustration burning just beneath the surface. But he refused to let it escalate. "Not here. Not now." At some point, a different flight attendant approached. It was Emily Carter, the one who had been kind to them earlier. She leaned down slightly, keeping her voice gentle and discreet. "Sir, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry if my colleague has caused any discomfort." Her eyes were earnest, filled with quiet regret. "Is there anything I can do to make this flight more pleasant for you and your sons?" Nathaniel met her gaze and offered a grateful smile. "We're fine. But thank you, I appreciate your kindness. It means a lot." Emily nodded, then turned to Lucas and Liam, her expression softening. "Anything I can get for you too? Maybe a different dessert? A refill on drinks?" Lucas and Liam exchanged a look before offering small smiles of their own. "Just some water and maybe a little fruit if that's okay," Liam said. Emily nodded immediately. "Of course. Be right back." And with that, she bustled away, her presence leaving a much-needed warmth behind. For the first time in hours, the tension in the air began to ease. Emily returned promptly, carrying their requests with ease. As she set down the drinks and fruit, she engaged Lucas and Liam in light-hearted conversation, her warm demeanor and unspoken reassurance. "So, what's the first thing you're planning to do in London?" she asked, genuinely interested. Liam's face lit up. "I can't wait to sketch the Tower of London. I've seen pictures, but I want to capture it in my own style." Lucas, not to be left out, chimed in. "I'm excited to read all the historical plaques and see Westminster Abbey. There's just something about standing where history actually happened." Emily chuckled. "You two are in for an amazing trip. London is full of history and inspiration. You'll love it." Her bright presence stood in stark contrast to Deborah's cold, watchful demeanor, and for that Nathaniel was silently grateful. He knew better than anyone that acts of kindness, no matter how small, could mean the world in moments like these. After Emily left, Lucas and Liam seemed more at ease, the warmth of her presence lingering just long enough to soften the tension that had followed them for much of the flight. Several hours later, the lights in the cabin gradually brightened, simulating morning. Passengers stirred awake, stretching and yawning as the flight crew moved through the aisle, preparing for arrival. Breakfast was served, and announcements filled the cabin, detailing the local time and weather in London. And just when Nathaniel thought he had seen the last of her, Deborah returned. She approached carefully, her voice carrying a thin layer of forced politeness. "We'll be landing shortly, sir," she said, her tone measured. "I trust that you and your sons had a satisfactory flight." Nathaniel's expression remained composed, unreadable. "It was all right," he replied simply. Lucas and Liam remained silent beside him, unsure if they should say anything at all. Deborah gave a small, tight nod, pressing her lips together. "If you need anything, please feel free to let us know." Nathaniel offered a single nod of acknowledgement, one that firmly ended the conversation. With a gentle bump, the plane touched down on the tarmac. Engines roared as the aircraft slowed in reverse thrust, and passengers began gathering their belongings, slipping laptops into bags, pocketing phones, and straightening their seats. Deborah lingered near the first-class aisle, ensuring everything remained in order. Nathaniel glanced out the window, watching as London's skyline came into view. This moment marked the beginning of something new for Lucas and Liam, a fresh chapter filled with new experiences, cultural exploration, and personal growth. And he refused to let one individual's prejudice overshadow what should be a wonderful trip. He would handle the matter, but on his own terms. The seatbelt signs switched off, and at last the cabin doors opened. Flight attendants moved into place, assisting passengers with disembarking. Deborah, still standing at the aisle, offered polite farewells to each traveler, her face a mask of professionalism. But as Nathaniel and his son stepped past her, he didn't look back, because what happened next wouldn't be handled in the air. It would be handled on the ground. As Lucas and Liam stepped off the plane, they were met with a genuine farewell from Emily Carter. She even bent down slightly, smiling warmly as she wished them a wonderful time in London. Her kindness wasn't just a courtesy, it was a stark contrast to the treatment they had received earlier, and Nathaniel silently appreciated it. Once they cleared the gate, Nathaniel guided his sons toward passport control. Though they were now on solid ground, a faint tension still lingered in the air. But Nathaniel had no intention of discussing it just yet, not in front of Lucas and Liam. His priority was to handle the matter discreetly, efficiently, and on his own terms. After they retrieved their luggage, he suggested they find a quiet spot to sit for a moment. "Stay here, keep an eye on the bags," he told them. "I just need to take care of something. Won't be long." Lucas and Liam nodded, settling into the waiting area. Nathaniel then made his way toward an airline assistant's desk, where a staff member in uniform stood ready to assist. The moment Nathaniel slid his elite membership card onto the counter, the staffer's posture straightened with immediate recognition. "Of course, Mr. Reed, how can I assist you?" Nathaniel lowered his voice, mindful of the people around them. "I'd like to file a formal concern regarding the behavior of a flight attendant on our flight today. Flight 107, inbound from New York." The staffer leaned in slightly, pen at the ready. "Certainly, I'll record all details. Do you have the attendant's name?" Nathaniel exhaled. "Deborah Simmons?" His tone was calm but firm. "She repeatedly questioned our right to be in first class. She made my sons feel uncomfortable. And she went beyond normal protocol. I'd like the matter looked into." The staffer nodded immediately. "We value your feedback, Mr. Reed. Rest assured this will be handled. Someone from our corporate office will reach out to you." They hesitated for a moment before adding, "Is there anything else I can do right now to address your immediate concerns?" Nathaniel offered a thin but polite smile. "No, thank you. My sons and I are looking forward to enjoying London. I just want to ensure the incident is documented." With that, he turned and made his way back to Lucas and Liam, who were still waiting patiently near their suitcases. Liam was fully absorbed in his sketchbook, capturing the bustling energy of the arrival hall, The hurried footsteps, the rolling luggage, the mosaic of travelers moving through the space. Lucas, on the other hand, was restless. The moment he spotted his father, he let out a relieved breath. "Everything okay?" Nathaniel gave a small nod. "Everything's handled. Let's get going." The tension eased as they stepped out into the fresh London air, weaving through the city's bustling streets toward their hotel. As they drove through the heart of the city, Lucas and Liam's initial unease melted into excitement once more. Their eyes widened at the sight of the black cabs, the iconic red double-decker buses, and the grand architecture that seemed so different from home. They had arrived. And Nathaniel intended to make sure that, from this moment forward, their experience would be nothing short of extraordinary. Nathaniel remained focused on ensuring that Lucas and Liam felt completely welcomed in this new environment. The next few days were filled with exploration and wonder. They wandered through museums brimming with history, admired centuries-old architecture, got lost in art galleries, and indulged in authentic local cuisine. With each passing day, Nathaniel watched his sons grow more confident, embracing the unfamiliar with a sense of adventure and curiosity. The unpleasantness aboard the flight slowly faded into the background of their memories, replaced by the thrill of discovery and new experiences. But while they immersed themselves in the beauty of London, a storm was quietly brewing behind the scenes. Unbeknownst to Deborah Simmons, the wheels of change had already been set in motion. When Nathaniel's formal complaint made its way through the airline's internal channels, it did not go unnoticed. Typically, a passenger concern would warrant nothing more than a polite follow-up or a standard corporate apology. But Nathaniel Reed was not just any passenger. Though he had always been discreet about his identity while traveling, the airline's upper management knew exactly who he was. One of the airline's top executives, a man named Christopher Lawson, was working through his inbox when the report landed on his screen. As he read the details of the incident, his expression darkened. Christopher knew that Nathaniel preferred to keep a low profile, traveling without announcing his influence. But this wasn't just a minor misunderstanding. If Deborah's behavior reflected a deeper issue, one of bias, misconduct, or a lack of professionalism, it couldn't be ignored. Without hesitation, Christopher began typing a response. "This requires immediate attention. Schedule a meeting with Deach Simmons and her supervisor. I will handle this personally. See ya." And so, while Nathaniel and his sons roamed historic streets, gazed at legendary landmarks, and indulged in warm, flaky pastries, a very different scene was unfolding within the airline's corporate offices. Management scrambled into action. Supervisors began combing through Deborah's past performance records. They reviewed passenger feedback, examined any prior complaints, and reached out to crew members from Flight 107. One name immediately surfaced: Emily Carter. She had been present for the entire ordeal, and her name was quickly flagged as a key witness. When contacted, Emily provided a straightforward, honest account. Without exaggeration or embellishment, she detailed Deborah's repeated attempts to question the family's right to be in first class, and the clear discomfort it caused. Meanwhile, Nathaniel had no intention of cutting his trip short to deal with corporate affairs. He had built an airline that operated on professionalism and integrity, and he trusted the system he had put in place to handle it properly. So, while others scrambled to address the issue, he continued to enjoy London with his sons, fully aware that soon enough, justice would take its course. Nathaniel had spent years building an airline that upheld the highest standards, not just in service but in integrity, professionalism, and respect. From the very beginning, he had insisted on rigorous training and a workplace culture built on fairness. Under his leadership, the airline maintained a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and misconduct. He had never asked for special treatment, not as a passenger, not as an executive. All he ever wanted was for the same high standards to apply to every traveler, regardless of appearance, background, or assumptions. And if Deborah Simmons had failed to meet those standards, then she needed to be reminded of her duty, or face the consequences. Each day in London was a gift for Lucas and Liam. They eagerly devoured traditional English breakfasts, savoring eggs, baked beans and crisp toast. They stood in awe before the grand Houses of Parliament, marveled at Tower Bridge, and wandered through the halls of Buckingham Palace. At the British Museum, they stared in fascination at the legendary Rosetta Stone, imagining the scholars who had cracked its code. Nathaniel took immense pride in watching their intellectual curiosity flourish. Lucas filled pages of his notebook with historical notes, eager to capture every fascinating detail. Liam, meanwhile, had sketchbooks overflowing, quick studies of statues, grand buildings, and the street performers who brought London's energy to life. Yet even in the midst of all this vibrant discovery, the memory of Deborah's treatment on the plane still cast a subtle shadow. One evening, back in their hotel room, Lucas finally voiced what had been on his mind. "Dad, I keep thinking about that flight attendant," he admitted, his brows furrowed. "She seemed so determined to prove we weren't supposed to be there." Nathaniel considered his response carefully. "Some people carry biases," he said evenly. "Maybe she thought first class belongs to a certain type of traveler. Maybe she thought you looked too young or too casual." He paused, meeting his son's gazes. "Maybe she made judgments based on the color of our skin. Or the way we dressed. We can't know for sure what was in her mind." Lucas frowned. "But we do know how it made us feel." Liam set his sketchbook aside. "It felt so unfair," he admitted quietly. Then, hesitantly, he added, "A part of me wanted to tell her who you really are. But I was scared. And you always taught us not to flaunt our advantages." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "Yes. If people know my position, they might treat me differently, but not always in a genuine way." He leaned back slightly, choosing his next words with care. "I prefer to see how they behave when they think I'm just any other passenger. Because that tells me who they really are." Lucas looked thoughtful. "So, you're okay with letting them think whatever they want? Just so you can see how they really act?" Nathaniel offered a small smile. "Partly." His voice took on a firmer edge. "But I also want them to learn from it. If Deborah treated us this way, chances are, she's done it to others. And that's not acceptable." His gaze hardened. "Once we return, I'll make sure it's addressed." Lucas and Liam nodded in quiet understanding. They respected their father's measured approach, even though the sting of the experience still lingered. It had opened their eyes to the complexities of adulthood, where fairness was not always guaranteed, and appearances often mattered more than merit. Despite the unsettling events of the flight, exhaustion overcame frustration, and they both slept soundly that night, their minds still buzzing with excitement for the adventures that awaited them in the coming days. Meanwhile, back at the airline's headquarters, in a sleek conference room at the airline's main office, Christopher Lawson sat at the head of a long table, his expression unreadable. In front of him sat Deborah Simmons, along with her direct supervisor, Natalie Green. Deborah's demeanor was a mix of pride and quiet defensiveness. She had no idea that the passenger who had filed the complaint was one of the most powerful figures in the airline industry. All she knew was that a serious complaint had been lodged against her, something highly uncommon in her long career. Christopher, a stern but fair executive, wasted no time. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice crisp. "We need to discuss a complaint we received regarding your conduct on Flight 107 from New York to London." He flipped open a folder of documents. "The passenger stated that you repeatedly questioned the legitimacy of his first-class tickets and subjected him and his sons to undue scrutiny." At this, Deborah stiffened. "I was doing my job," she replied immediately, her voice defensive. "We have procedures." Her supervisor, Natalie Green, turned to her with a cautionary look. "We all follow procedures, Deborah," she said evenly. "But from what I've read, it sounds like you went beyond normal policy." Deborah squared her shoulders. "I was ensuring the safety and comfort of our first-class passengers," she insisted, her voice sharpening. Christopher's expression remained unmoved. "And by ensuring safety, you mean repeatedly questioning a father and his two sons, despite seeing their fully valid boarding passes?" Deborah huffed slightly, but she did not break eye contact. "We have to be careful about who sits in first class." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I didn't see any evidence that the father and his sons were typical first-class travelers." There was a beat of silence. Christopher folded his hands on the table, his gaze sharp. And by typical, you mean what, exactly? Deborah hesitated, but before she could respond, Natalie spoke first. Deborah, be honest. Are you saying you assumed they didn't belong in first class because of how they looked? Because of the way they were dressed? Christopher let the question hang in the air. Slowly, Deborah's expression tightened. They were dressed very casually, she admitted. And they were young. I had to be sure. Christopher flipped through his documents again. According to witness reports, your behavior caused significant discomfort. The father provided valid tickets, and yet you requested additional verification multiple times. Deborah's jaw tensed, but she gave a small, stiff nod. Yes, they were minors. I needed to confirm their status. Christopher's eyes narrowed slightly. Our records indicate that the family was, in fact, traveling on fully paid first-class tickets. He closed the folder with a quiet thud, then leveled Deborah with a measured gaze. So, tell me again, Deborah, what exactly were you confirming? Christopher's expression remained unwavering as he spoke. Our records show no irregularities. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. Are you aware that this passenger has traveled in first class multiple times before, without any issues? And that no other attendants have ever questioned him or his family? Deborah's eyes flickered with surprise. She glanced at Natalie, perhaps searching for support. I wasn't aware of his history, she admitted, shifting slightly in her seat. Then, as if grasping for justification, she added, I only acted based on what I saw. And they didn't look appropriate for first class. Christopher's frown deepened. His voice remained steady but sharp. What do you mean by appropriate? Deborah paused, choosing her words carefully. They were dressed very casually, she said at last. And they were a bit loud for that cabin. Typically, I expect a different kind of demeanor from first-class passengers. Silence hung in the room. Christopher exchanged a look with Natalie, and he didn't need to say a word. The implication in Deborah's statement was crystal clear. At last, Christopher leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. First-class passengers pay for comfort and service, not a dress code. His voice was measured but firm. Some travel for business. Some for leisure. Their attire, their demeanor, their background, none of it entitles you to treat them differently. He let the statement sink in before adding, would you have treated them the same way if they had matched your expectations of what a first-class traveler should look like? A deep flush crept up Deborah's cheeks. Her posture stiffened as she squared her shoulders. I was just doing my duty, she muttered. I didn't think it was a problem. Natalie's voice cut through the air, calm but unyielding. Deborah, you've been a flight attendant for nearly 20 years. You should know by now that our policy is to treat all passengers with equal respect and courtesy, regardless of how they look. She folded her arms. If they had valid tickets, the only time you should question them is if there's a legitimate reason to suspect an issue. Her eyes locked onto Deborah's. According to the complaint, you persisted, even after confirming their tickets multiple times. Deborah sat in stony silence. Her pride warred with unease, the reality of the situation settling in. Christopher picked up the final sheet of paper from the table. Then, in a voice calm but edged with finality, he delivered the blow. There's something else you should know. Pause. Then. The passenger in question is not just any traveler. His gaze locked onto Deborah. He is one of the principal owners of this airline. His name is Nathaniel Reed. Deborah's face drained of color. Her mouth parted slightly as if trying to form words, but nothing came out. She stared at Christopher in utter disbelief. He owns the airline? Christopher nodded. Yes. He keeps his identity private when traveling so that our staff are consistent in their professionalism. He closed the file in front of him, his expression unreadable. Unfortunately, this incident highlights the very problem he was trying to expose. Christopher's voice remained calm yet unwavering. What Nathaniel Reed is trying to address is bigger than just this one incident. He let his words settle. Prejudice or assumptions about whom belongs in first class are unacceptable. His gaze locked onto Deborah. This is a serious matter. Deborah's voice wavered. I didn't know. I just thought. Christopher cut her off gently but firmly. Whether you knew or not is irrelevant. His tone remained even but sharp enough to make his point clear. Our policy doesn't change based on a passenger's position. But the fact that you treated him that way, and that you singled out his sons, shows us there's a deeper issue. Natalie, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. Her voice was measured but resolute. I'm recommending a formal letter of warning, along with mandatory diversity and sensitivity training. She gave Deborah a pointed look. You do understand that this is a lenient measure, right? Pause. Then. If Mr. Reed had chosen to escalate this further, the consequences could have been much more severe. Deborah's eyes fell to the table, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She nodded stiffly, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. After a long moment, she managed to mutter a stammering apology. I'm sorry. I truly am. She swallowed hard. I had no intention of discriminating against them. I was only trying to be cautious. Christopher let out a slow, measured breath. He studied Deborah for a moment before responding. We appreciate that you recognize the need to apologize, he said. Then his tone hardened slightly. But an apology means nothing if it doesn't lead to changed behavior. He folded his hands in front of him, voice steady. Our airline cannot afford to lose trust, especially not because of an employee's personal biases. With that, the meeting concluded. Deborah rose from her chair, her movements slower, more subdued than when she had entered. She left the room in near silence, the weight of embarrassment and regret pressing down on her. As the door shut behind her, Christopher and Natalie remained seated, quietly finalizing their notes. Christopher tapped his fingers against the table, already knowing his next step. He planned to email Nathaniel personally, informing him of the outcome and assuring him that corrective actions had been taken. Meanwhile in London, while a meeting room buzzed with corporate discussions, Nathaniel and his sons were having a vastly different kind of morning. They stood along the banks of the Thames, the London skyline stretching before them. Lucas lifted his camera, capturing the towering spires of Parliament. Liam, ever the artist, sat on a nearby bench, his pencil gliding across the pages of his sketchbook as he tried to capture the way the morning light danced on the water. Nathaniel watched them with quiet pride. These were the moments he cherished most. Moments of peaceful exploration, free from tension, free from conflict. And that was exactly what he had wanted for them all along. Later that afternoon, as they returned to the hotel, Nathaniel pulled out his phone. A new email from Christopher Lawson sat at the top of his inbox. His eyes scanned the message, absorbing the details, the meeting, Deborah's reaction, and the disciplinary steps that had been taken. And as he finished reading, a quiet sense of relief settled over him. Justice had been served. And now, it was time to leave the past behind and embrace the rest of the adventure ahead. Nathaniel appreciated how quickly and thoroughly the situation had been handled. He had faith that the resolution would serve as a warning to any other employee who might act in a similar way. That evening, over dinner at a cozy restaurant tucked away in a narrow street near Covent Garden, Nathaniel decided it was time to let Lucas and Liam know what had transpired back at the airline. They were halfway through a meal of fish and chips, and Liam was animatedly describing the paintings he had seen at the National Gallery, his hands gesturing as he spoke. At a natural pause in the conversation, Nathaniel cleared his throat. I received an update about the flight attendant, he said. Lucas and Liam immediately looked up, attentive. The airline took immediate steps. He set his glass down. She faced disciplinary action and will be required to attend additional training sessions. She also apologized, though indirectly, for what she did. Lucas set down his fork, his expression thoughtful. Really? They responded that fast. Nathaniel nodded. They take these matters seriously, especially since fairness and professionalism are the foundation of our business. Liam's eyes flickered with relief. So, she won't do that to anyone else? Nathaniel offered a small nod. That's the goal. They're making sure she understands that kind of behavior isn't acceptable. Lucas swirled the water in his glass, a pensive expression settling over his face. Do you think she would have apologized if she hadn't found out who you are? Nathaniel paused, considering the question carefully. Then he answered honestly. I can't say for sure. He exhaled slowly. But what matters is that the airline is addressing the problem. My hope is that she learns from this, and treats all passengers with respect moving forward. Liam let out a soft sigh, pushing a piece of fish around on his plate. I guess that's the best we can hope for. Nathaniel offered his son a small, reassuring smile. Sometimes change happens one step at a time. But the important thing is that it does happen. With that, the conversation shifted naturally. The twins were soon marveling over the wonders they had seen that day, the layers of history, culture, and stories woven into London's streets. Nathaniel, for his part, felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that the airline he had helped build had the right rules and the right people in place. People who would act when it mattered most. But even as he sat there, watching his sons talk excitedly about the city around them, he couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. He knew that not everyone who experienced discrimination had the same level of recourse that he did. And that thought fueled his ongoing commitment to ensuring that the airline remained a place where every passenger, no matter their background, was treated with fairness and respect. The following morning, the family boarded a train to explore the English countryside, setting off on yet another adventure. And this time they did so with lighter hearts, knowing that while bias and assumptions still existed in the world, they had the power to challenge them, and the responsibility to demand better. A journey through the English countryside. Rolling green hills dotted with sheep stretched across the horizon, their soft curves interrupted only by ancient stone walls and winding hedge-lined roads. From the window of the train, the landscape passed by in a picturesque blur, an ever-changing painting of farms, fields, and timeless countryside charm. Lucas sat with his nose buried in a book, reading about the legends and folklore surrounding England's ancient castles. Liam, ever the artist, had his sketchbook open across his lap, his pencil gliding across the page as he captured the beauty of the fields and scattered farmhouses. Nathaniel, meanwhile, simply enjoyed the rare chance to slow down. For a man accustomed to the relentless pace of business meetings, corporate decisions, and global travel, this was a true respite, a moment to breathe, observe, and just be. A conversation about prejudice. Midway through the journey, the conversation took a thoughtful turn, drifting back to the concept of prejudice and the many ways it manifests, often in subtle, insidious forms. It was Lucas who brought it up first, reflecting on experiences he had faced at school. I remember when some teachers or classmates doubted me, not because of anything I did but just because of who they assumed I was. Liam looked up from his sketchbook, nodding in quiet agreement. Same here. I remember that art competition last year, the judges barely looked at my work. I knew I had put my heart into those pieces, but their reaction, it was like they had already decided how much I was worth before even seeing my art. Nathaniel listened intently, letting them express their frustrations before offering his thoughts. Whenever you face something like that, remember this: your worth isn't defined by what someone else thinks. He met their gazes, his voice steady and firm. If someone refuses to see you for who you are, that's their problem, not yours. Your job is to keep moving forward. Never let their doubt become your own. Lucas and Liam nodded, absorbing their father's words. They had always been proud of who they were, proud of their heritage, proud of their father's accomplishments, and proud of their own talents. But this conversation crystallized something important for them. Bias existed. Prejudice was real. But they had the power to rise above it, and thrive despite it. The final days in England. The rest of their time in England was peaceful, a tapestry of cultural experiences and meaningful father-son moments. They explored hidden bookshops, discovered charming cafes, and spent hours wandering through museums. By the time they began packing their bags for the journey home, a bittersweet feeling settled over them. Lucas and Liam felt a tinge of sadness that their adventure was ending, but also a rush of excitement to return home and share their stories with Clara. Nathaniel, too, looked forward to the warmth of family, to his wife's familiar presence, and to returning to the comforts of daily life. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He would return to work more vigilant than ever, ensuring that the airline he helped build remained a place of fairness, professionalism, and respect for all passengers. Departure day. On the morning of their departure, they arrived at London's bustling airport, their spirits renewed and anticipatory. This time, Nathaniel had arranged a different flight route, giving them the opportunity to see more of Europe's skies on their way home. As they approached the check-in desk, a uniformed agent glanced at Nathaniel's top-tier membership card, recognition immediately lighting up her face. She straightened with practiced professionalism, offering them a warm and courteous greeting. This time there were no assumptions. No questions. No doubt. Just the smooth, seamless service that every passenger, regardless of their background, deserved. And with that, their journey home began. A departure without complications. At the check-in counter, the agent greeted them warmly, processing their tickets with efficiency and ease. There were no complications. No hesitant glances. No unnecessary questions. Just a genuine smile and a simple wish for a pleasant flight. As they made their way through security, Lucas and Liam chatted excitedly about the souvenirs they had collected, the notebooks brimming with Liam's sketches and the hundreds of photos Lucas had carefully saved on his phone. Nathaniel felt a wave of gratitude. For all its complexities, the airline, his airline, typically operated as it should, providing the smooth and welcoming experience that all travelers deserved. He understood better than most the difference a good flight attendant could make. A single crew member could transform a stressful journey into a comforting, even memorable experience. A flight that felt right. After a leisurely stroll through the terminal shops, they boarded their flight. This time there was no Deborah Simmons in sight. The flight attendants, none of whom carried the same cold scrutiny Deborah had, exhibited the kind of warm, respectful professionalism that Nathaniel had always valued in his company. The captain's voice filled the cabin, welcoming travelers aboard. The first-class section felt inviting, every step of the process unfolding seamlessly. It was a reminder of what travel should feel like, effortless, comfortable, and welcoming for all. Homecoming. When they touched down back home, Clara was waiting for them at arrivals. The moment Lucas and Liam spotted her, they rushed forward, practically talking over each other, their words tumbling into an excited blur as they tried to describe every detail of their adventure. Nathaniel smiled, standing a step behind, watching the reunion unfold. Then Clara's eyes met his. A silent question flickered in her gaze. How did it go? Nathaniel gave her a reassuring nod. A quiet signal. That though the journey had not been without its complications, it had ultimately been a success. Reflections in the car. Once they were in the car, their luggage securely stored in the trunk, Clara turned to Nathaniel with a more direct question. So, what happened with the flight attendant? Nathaniel explained calmly, detailing how the airline had handled the situation, the disciplinary measures imposed, and the required training that had been put in place. Clara listened, her expression shifting between quiet concern and relief. She felt sympathy for those who might face such treatment without the means to fight back. And gratitude, that Nathaniel had the influence to challenge it head-on. Life resumes, but the lesson remains. Soon enough, life returned to its usual rhythm. Lucas and Liam prepared for school, eager to share stories from their travels with friends and teachers. Liam proudly displayed his sketches, each one capturing a piece of London's spirit. Lucas, ever the historian, gave a spirited presentation on British history, his enthusiasm infectious. And Nathaniel? He immersed himself once again in the responsibilities of running an airline, attending meetings, reviewing policies, and ensuring that the values he had built his company on remained strong. But even as he returned to his daily routine, one thought lingered. Not everyone who experiences bias or discrimination has the ability to push back. And that was something he intended to continue changing, one decision at a time. An unexpected letter. Life resumed at its usual pace. Nathaniel found himself deep in strategizing new airline routes, attending meetings and expanding the company's future reach. But one day something unexpected arrived. A carefully written letter from Deborah Simmons. Nathaniel sat in his home office, his eyes scanning the words on the page. Deborah wrote with humility, admitting that she had come to recognize the bias that had shaped her actions. She expressed deep regret for making his family uncomfortable and thanked him for indirectly showing her where she needed to improve. She also acknowledged that she had begun her sensitivity training, actively learning about the impact of unconscious prejudice. Nathaniel read the letter twice, then decided to share it with Clara and the twins over dinner. They took turns reading it in thoughtful silence. Finally, Liam looked up first. "Dad, do you think she really means it?" Nathaniel considered his words carefully. "I like to believe she does," he said at last. "It's not easy to admit when you were wrong." Lucas ran his finger along the edge of the paper, thinking, maybe this will make her better at her job. Maybe she'll be kinder to other passengers now. Nathaniel nodded. That's the goal. Everyone has the ability to learn, if they're willing. Change takes root. In the weeks that followed, Nathaniel quietly followed up with the airline's HR department. He wanted to see if there had been any further complaints about Deborah's conduct. There were none. It seemed that her behavior had indeed changed. And within the airline, the story soon became a cautionary tale. Staff members began reminding each other, treat every passenger with respect, because you never know who they might be. But more importantly, because it's simply the right thing to do. A lasting lesson. For Lucas and Liam, the experience became a lesson in the subtle ways prejudice can manifest. And, more importantly, how a calm but firm response could lead to real, meaningful change. They recognized that not everyone had a father who owned an airline, but everyone deserved dignity and fairness. From the most frequent flyer to the occasional traveler, respect should never be conditional. Their father's decision to travel incognito also left a lasting impression on them. It reinforced a powerful truth. A person's true character is revealed when they think no one is watching. How people behave toward others who have nothing to offer them, that was the real measure of who they were. Another flight, another chance to observe. Not long after, the day came when Nathaniel needed to travel again, this time for business. He was flying alone, heading to a conference overseas. At the airport curb, Clara and the twins waved him off, smiling as he grabbed his carry-on. As he approached the check-in desk, the agent greeted him politely. No hesitation. No judgment. No assumptions. Just professionalism as it should be. And as Nathaniel walked through the terminal, he couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. Because this time he wasn't just observing. He was watching a culture shift, one flight at a time. A flight like any other, yet different. There was no special fanfare as Nathaniel boarded the plane, and that was exactly how he preferred it. As he made his way to his seat, he felt the familiar hum of pre-flight energy. Crew members moved swiftly up and down the aisles, ensuring everything was in place. Passengers stowed their bags, rummaged for books, adjusted their seat belts, or simply settled in for the journey ahead. Nathaniel took his usual place in first class, discreetly observing the interactions around him. This time the flight attendants were warm, attentive, and professional, as they should be. At one point, one of them, noticing his quiet demeanor, approached with a polite smile. "Is there anything I can get you, sir?" Nathaniel shook his head gently, declining the offer. "I'm all set, thank you." He settled into his seat, gazing momentarily toward the cabin. And then his mind drifted. It hadn't been so long ago that a very different flight attendant had approached him in a very different manner. But now he felt something else. Hope. Hope that the system he had helped build was working. Hope that people could grow. Hope that the airline he cared for continued to uphold values of respect and fairness. He turned to the window, watching as the runway lights flickered against the night, reflections bouncing off the sleek wings of the plane. It was remarkable how much a single flight could reveal. Preconceptions, biases, kindness, apologies, learning, and sometimes, even transformation. Lessons at 30,000 feet. As the hush settled just before takeoff, Nathaniel's thoughts wandered home. He pictured Lucas and Liam, their excited chatter filling the house as they recounted every detail of their London adventure, for what had to be the 100th time. He smiled to himself. Their trip had been more than just a vacation. It had been a lesson in human nature, a testament to both the joys of exploration and the realities of the world they lived in. And even for Deborah Simmons, change had taken root. Perhaps small at first, but change nonetheless. The plane lifted off, cutting through the sky with a smooth, steady surge. Nathaniel inhaled deeply, letting the familiar hum of the engine settle over him like a lullaby. He thought back to everything that had transpired. A flight attendant's bias. 2 young boys caught in a moment of hurt and confusion. A father's measured response. And the lesson learned, not just for Deborah but for everyone involved. It was a reminder that transformation often begins in the smallest moments. That sometimes, even at 30,000 feet, among strangers who might never cross paths again, there was still an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to be better. A quiet legacy. And so life continued. Nathaniel moved forward, quietly guiding the airline he loved. Never seeking recognition. Never chasing accolades. But always insisting on fairness. Because every passenger's story mattered. And even as Lucas and Liam grew older, they would always hold on to that London trip. Not just as a memory of adventure, but as a testament to both the beauty of the world and the challenges they had learned to navigate. The final lesson. Clara watched over her family with unwavering love, always standing by Nathaniel as he worked to cultivate a world where courtesy and mutual respect were not exceptions, but the standard. Because sometimes, the biggest revelations happen in the most unexpected places. For Deborah Simmons, it happened aboard a transatlantic flight, where she discovered that the two boys she had quietly doubted were not alone. They were accompanied by a father who owned the very airline she worked for. That twist of fate forced her to confront her assumptions and, more importantly, gave her a chance to change. For Nathaniel and his sons, the moment confirmed the importance of standing firm against prejudice, while also offering a path toward redemption. Because change isn't just about calling out what's wrong, it's about creating opportunities for people to do better. A simple, powerful truth. Ultimately, every person who heard this story walked away with the same realization. You never really know the story or value of the person next to you. And when you choose to treat people with respect, without assumptions, without bias, you help create a world that is kinder, fairer, and more welcoming. One flight at a time. The story of Nathaniel Reed and his two sons on their flight to London is not just a case of customer service but a reflection of a common reality in life: prejudice and how people judge others based on appearances. In real life, we often encounter similar situations where misjudgment based on looks or social status leads to unfair treatment. Many people face discrimination in the workplace, are denied opportunities, or receive poor service simply because they do not fit a certain societal standard. What stands out in this story is how Nathaniel did not react with anger but with calmness and deliberate action. He did not use his power to punish but instead allowed the system to work and gave someone the opportunity to change. This is a powerful lesson. How we respond to injustice is just as important as recognizing it. Deborah's realization of her mistake and her willingness to change sends a positive message, reminding us that anyone can learn and grow if they are willing to. Society improves when people reflect on their behavior and make adjustments when necessary. Ultimately, the greatest lesson from this story is that respect is not a privilege reserved for a few. It should be a fundamental principle in human interactions. When we choose to treat others with kindness and fairness, we not only make a difference in their lives but also help create a more just and compassionate world.